Welcome back to the Extra Zone Arcade. In anticipation for that new 3D Mario we're probably getting with the Switch 2's launch, we'll be looking back on every mainline Mario entry that got us to this point. Since this is the first episode of this series, let's establish a few things. First, this retrospective is mainly celebrating the anniversary of the Super Mario series, not Mario as a whole. That means we'll be starting with 1985's Super Mario Bros. And working our way up to 2023's Super Mario Bros. Wonder. So no, Donkey Kong, Mario Bros. Or whatever other spin-offs don't count. And speaking of Mario Wonder, I likely won't cover it as I have a perfectly decent review from last year that I still stand by. But I may still talk about it later in this series, or maybe make a short follow-up of that original review if these videos do well enough. That's where you guys come in. Make sure you're subscribed so you can catch every episode. Leave a like and a comment so I know there's interest in seeing that. Here are all the games we'll be covering. Of course, there's a lot of debate as to what qualifies as a mainline Mario game, but here are some of my rules. 1. It has to be a platformer in which you primarily control Mario. 2. The word Super needs to be in the title. And 3. It has to have been developed by either Nintendo's EAD/EPD or R&D1 teams. All good? So, I guess we should jump back in time to the mid-80s to truly kick this journey off. After the worldwide success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo, and more specifically Shigeru Miyamoto, were interested as to where they could take these characters. The first change was that this Mario fellow, as they're now calling him, should be a plumber instead of a carpenter, and that he should have a brother that wears green. To complement that, the setting of this game is an underground sewer system in the Bronx, instead of a super high scaffolding. And instead of a big angry ape as your opponent, there's a smorgasbord of weird creatures like shell creepers, sidesteppers, and fighter flies. Hey, they did turtles in the sewer before those other guys existed. And so this strange new game releases Mario Bros. In arcades, and Nintendo's new Famicom system in 1983 to good reception, and more importantly, money. So, with Nintendo's efforts to branch out and innovate in the video game space, there came plenty of other exciting titles. Like this one where you drive a bike and holy shit, the screen scrolls to the side! With this revelation, Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka got to cooking up a game where you go through a journey in different lands. The levels were physically drawn up and laid out on graph paper, and they would use clear sheet whenever they wanted to make edits to it. Kinda crazy when you consider that now we have games where you can just do this, in the game. Alright, let's slap Mario in there because he's pretty popular, but we need to make him twice as big this time. Okay, well we didn't mean literally, but this works too. We'll bring his palette swap brother back as a second player, and give them new power-up abilities to go through these different courses. Bam! You now have a game that was pretty much an instant success and spawned a multi-billion-dollar franchise that will have some guy who was born almost 20 years after it came out talk about it to an audience of approximately 5 people. Anyway, Super Mario Bros. Initially released on September 13th of 1985, and was praised for its innovative side-scrolling platform gameplay. It went on to become one of the best-selling video games of all time, and even recovered gaming as a whole from an industry-wide crash. Well, only in the United States, but still. Real talk, I think because this space is dominated by American gamers, the whole video game crash of 1983 has been played up pretty dramatically online. No such thing ever happened in other regions, but these dudes will have you believe it was some worldwide cataclysmic event. Regardless, the NES and Super Mario Bros. Are to thank for the millions of games that have released since. It really was something groundbreaking and redefined what it meant to make a video game. It wasn't just a basic sports or arcade game with a single screen, but a whole adventure. But as someone who wasn't around during that time, how do I feel about it? Well, let's talk about Super Mario Bros. From the Gen Z perspective. My first experience with this game was through playing it on those emulator websites in school. We'd have a 1-hour session at the end of the week where you could either go outside and play, or play in the computer labs, so I'd pretty much always check out these sites. I played a couple Mario games prior, those being New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Super Mario Galaxy 2 at friends' houses. Despite having a DS, I never actually owned any Mario games on it, just some of the cheaper licensed games. We couldn't really afford the good shit yet, so after playing those I needed to fulfill my Mario fix, and that's how I discovered emulators. They quickly became a lifelong companion for me. So yeah, I ended up playing pretty much every classic Mario game through this method. Mario 1 was a game I'd grind out a lot in my free time, and is what got me interested in the development and history of games, as well as older titles like this. The game's story goes a little something like this. Princess Toadstool rules over the peaceful Mushroom Kingdom, until one day the Koopas attack. Their king uses black magic to trap the mushroom denizens in blocks and kidnaps the princess. Mario and Luigi catch wind of the evil goings-on and the two set out to free the princess and liberate her people. King Koopa must go down at all costs. A nice simple premise, but a little more background than you'd get in your average arcade space shooter. Not bad. But, spoiler alert, Mario stories pretty much never get more complex than this. Some are even more simple if you can believe it. Even back then, Nintendo knew what you were really here for though, and that's the gameplay. This is an interactive medium after all, so how does that interactivity fare? Immediately upon starting the game, you're given the option to play by yourself as Mario, or have someone join you as Luigi. The two-player mode basically just has you take turns, so as soon as one player dies or finishes a stage, it's the other's turn. Luigi himself is no different to Mario, quite literally a palette swap and nothing more. He doesn't have any of the unique properties he's come to be known for yet. Your moveset with both the bros is run, sprint, jump, crouch, swim, climb, and shoot fireballs, the latter of which can only be done if you grab a fire flower. And that's it. For the time, that was a lot of action, but now it's not all that impressive. Those mechanics quickly became mainstays for the series, though once we moved to 3D, sprinting and fire flower usage take a break for a while. The game feel here is stiff and heavy. Mario has a weird acceleration curve where he starts out really slow but gets up to top speed quickly when holding down the sprint button. This can make tighter platforming sections difficult since you can pretty easily either undershoot or overshoot your jumps. It isn't the most difficult thing to get used to, but it is one of this game's many quirks. Another of which is that adjusting yourself as you make your jumps is almost impossible. If you make a jump, you better commit to it because Mario has next to no aerial mobility here and he drops really fast. The screen also famously doesn't scroll backwards, so you definitely need to play more carefully in some sections as a result. When swimming, Mario bobs up and down kinda awkwardly, which can make it difficult to dodge enemies, just feels very finicky. On the flip side, once you do get moving at a good and consistent pace, it starts to click. This game has developed a pretty competitive speedrunning scene, pretty much dating back to its release, because of that satisfying flow state you get when moving fast and nailing jumps. Collision is rarely wonky in this game, and you're generally given enough screen real estate to anticipate enemies and obstacles ahead of you. Overall, the controls and game feel definitely show their age, but when it works, this game actually kinda holds up. Mostly. Jumping on a springboard is a good example of how this game feels to play in a nutshell. You're supposed to hold down the jump button to bounce up higher, but sometimes it just won't work. Or worse, it'll work, but Mario's forward momentum cancels the upward momentum, and he just sorta slips off. But when you do get that really high jump, it feels pretty exhilarating. In terms of enemies, this game has quite a few, and they've all become iconic in their own right. Goombas, Koopa Troopers, Piranha Plants, Cheep Cheep, Bloopers, Lakitu, Spinies, Buzzy Beetles, Bullet Bills, Podobos, and you! Most enemies are dealt with by jumping on them, but each will have different methods. Koopas retract into their shell once stomped that can be kicked to defeat other enemies, or even you. Spinies, Podoboos, and Piranha Plants can't be stomped at all, and Bloopers could be stomped in theory, but they're always found in water, so you can't. Run into any of these guys and... Grabbing a super mushroom turns you into Super Mario or Luigi, allowing you to take just one extra hit, so make sure to check those question mark boxes to see if you can get one. Hit a block with an item in it while already super, and you'll get a fire flower, which as mentioned before, lets you shoot out fireballs. This is great for dealing with pretty much every enemy short of Bullet Bills, Podoboos, and Buzzy Beetles. Trust me, you'll want to make sure you have one of these when it comes to those pesky water levels. I always hated these, not only because they break the game's pacing, but they're also just janky as all hell. Sometimes an invisible current will just drag you down as you're trying to avoid enemies, and you'll die. They do improve at least a little as the series moves forward, but I just never saw the point in them at all. The rest of the levels are honestly pretty well designed though, even if there is a bit of repetition here and there. There's really not all that much I would say is completely unfair here. Naturally, being a console game in a predominantly arcade era, there are some things here intended to eat up your lives and extend your playtime. The way they'd encourage you to spend your money on games instead of just renting them was to make them really difficult, which would pretty much just artificially increase the amount of time you spent on it. This game isn't totally devoid of that, but it feels a little more forgiving than some of its contemporaries, one of which we'll be talking about in just a minute, God rest my soul. My favourite level has to be either 4-1 or 4-3. They're essentially just remixed versions of their World 1 counterparts, but with more of an emphasis on speed. Coming back to that flow state, these levels here are the ones that feel the best once you're locked in. 4-1 in particular has become pretty iconic for being the speedrun level of the game, where you pretty much don't stop for anything. Even these Piranha Plants can't get you if you time your jumps well due to their misaligned hitbox. The worst level has to be 7-2. It's a water level, so it already has that working against it, but it's pretty much just a harder version of 2-2 with way more cheep. Fun fact, this is the level that the infamous Minus World is based on. The Minus World being a glitch where you clip through the pipe at the end of 1-2, end up at the warp room on the other side, and go down the leftmost one. Then you have to play this 7-2 clone level infinitely. Sounds like a personal hell for me. There's also underground levels that aren't really too remarkable other than the fact that you can just run above the ceiling and ignore the entire thing. These stages are also typically where the warp zones are, meaning you can beat the entire game only playing 8 of the 32 levels. This is how some people have been able to famously beat the whole thing in under 5 minutes. It's pretty cool. Hell, in 4-2's case, the vine to get up to the warp area is almost right at the start, so you barely even have to play that one. The overworld stages have a little more variety. There's your basic type where you run from left to right avoiding enemies and obstacles while picking up power-ups. There are the mushroom platforming focused stages where you have to navigate around bottomless pits carefully, and the cheap bridge chases. These levels are accompanied by that oh so iconic Super Mario theme. There genuinely cannot be a single living human who hasn't heard at least some variation of this song. The last level type are the castles, the most dangerous stages in the game, with fire bars to dodge, lava pits to jump, and Bowser at the end. He can be taken out by either getting past him, grabbing the axe and taking out the bridge, or pumping him full of fireballs. The latter method actually reveals that the first 7 out of 8 Bowsers you face are fakes, regular enemies disguised as the Koopa Tyrant. The final Bowser in the game's last level is the real deal, and once you get past him, you've done it. The princess is saved and the kingdom is now at peace. From here you can start a new and harder game where Goombas are replaced with buzzy beetles and all enemies move at double the speed. Nothing changes if you get through this mode though, but I guess it's just something extra which is always nice. So that's Super Mario Bros, a game that by today's standards is nothing special, but when looked at from the lens of the time it was released, it's really impressive what they are able to do. The mechanics, levels and visuals were all far above the rest, and this game really is to thank for the crazy evolution of the medium. If nothing else, I'd recommend trying out this game just to see where it all began. Though I would actually suggest you play the Super Mario All-Stars version. This was a collection of the NES Super Mario games remastered in 16-bit. The controls, mechanics and level design are all unchanged, but the graphics are much nicer with better sound quality and a save feature to boot. This is still the definitive version of the game to date in my opinion. You can play both this and the original NES version on basically everything, so maybe even try out both if you're curious. But now the fun ends. If you've read this video's title, then you know we're not done here just yet. No, in fact, we have a whole other game to talk about here. After the release and immediate rousing success of the first game, Nintendo got straight to work on a sequel. Well, not exactly. You see, they released an alternate version of the original game in arcades called Versus Super Mario Bros. This was a harder version of the game that would actually have several new and much more difficult levels added. These levels were the basis for the true Super Mario Bros. Sequel they were planning, since they had so much fun developing them. And so they got to work on Super Mario Bros. 2, a game that was intended to be as ball-bustingly difficult as they could get away with. Those levels from Versus Super Mario Bros. Actually made it into the game as well. The game would release for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, only in Japan. Why? Because this game was considered way too difficult for Western audiences. Huh, well, maybe they just think we're too stupid. I mean, there's no way this game could be that... Oh. Right. Oh no. Yeah, this game is a huge steaming pile of bullshit. First, let's talk about the positives. There aren't many. The graphics, although mostly unchanged from the original Super Mario Bros., do look a little bit better and more detailed. Bushes and clouds now have eyes, which is something that would become a staple of the Mario franchise's art direction, and the HUD now has a drop shadow, which makes it much more readable. That's all I've got. The controls, physics, music, sound effects, enemies, bosses, and level progression are all the same as the first. Even the story is exactly the same, but it's kinda implied to be like an alternate take or B-side to Mario 1. To be fair, direct sequels like this were rare back then, so there wasn't really a formula for what makes a good sequel. That said, they could have easily improved some of those aspects for this game without having to change up the formula too much. Interesting that for the other sequel we'll be talking about in the next part, they went in the complete opposite direction. Stay tuned for that, by the way. Anyway, now we'll talk about some of the new additions. First, they took away the 2-player mode, and now you can only choose to play the game with Mario or Luigi. While Mario retains the same playstyle of the original, Luigi now has his different properties that he's become famous for. That being the higher jump and butter on his shoes, because this man will slip and slide everywhere like every platform is covered in ice. This means there are some sections that make the game easier with him, but others that make things much harder. A new power-up, or I guess power down in this case, was added, the Poison Mushroom. In the NES version, it's damn near indistinguishable from the Super Mushroom, and you can probably guess what happens if you pick it up. There's a new obstacle added to some levels as well, a strong gust of wind. Sounds kinda weird, but trust me when I say that this can fuck you up in unimaginable ways. The worst examples of this being in World 7-3 and C-3, where you're forced to make blind leap of faith jumps using the already janky springs where the wind is constantly blowing. This means you're probably gonna misjudge your landing completely and fall into the abyss. Not to mention if you overshoot and the screen scrolls just a little too far to the right, you might as well just put down the controller because you're already dead. Easily the worst levels in the game. The best was probably 3-3 since it's a short level without really anything unfair, and can be pretty fun to platform through at high speed. That's about it though. The rest of the levels are either completely unremarkable or downright infuriating to play with shoddy design all around. I mean, level sections where there's an unclearable pit with the only way to get through being to hit invisible blocks is insanely stupid. Or hell, do the same thing, but this time it's a giant wall of dirt. Like, did they even try? And just the number of enemies and obstacles this game likes to throw at you. You constantly need to be on guard and analyzing patterns just to find that one ultra specific moment where you can get through without getting hurt. And then there are some parts where you straight up can't get through it without taking a hit. D4 is legitimately not possible as Super Mario because of this one part with a fire bar. It's basically completely impassable. Oh wow, and would you look at that? As if Hammer Bros couldn't get any worse, they now chase you down! Like they had to have known what they were doing with this. You might even want to try using a warp zone to skip as much of this hellish experience as possible, but you better make sure it isn't one of the ones that sends you back to a previous world! This game had to have been the origin of those Kaizo ROM hacks because this shit genuinely is on that level. I've talked about some of the extra worlds already, those being the ones that start with a letter. You might have noticed that I've been showing footage of the All-Stars version for these, and it's because of one simple reason. On the 8-bit version, you need to beat the game not once, not twice, not even 5 times, but 8. You have to put yourself through this nightmare 8 times just to suffer more. You thankfully only have to do it once in All-Stars, but honestly, you aren't missing much by not playing these. Most of them are just slightly harder versions of earlier levels and are usually over before they can make much of an impression. You don't get anything for finishing these either, but goddamn, my boy Luigi clearly got busy with the princess here. Also, in 8-4, there are 2 Bowsers for some reason. Apparently the first one you face in that random hallway is Bowser's brother? Yeah, no fucking idea what this was about, and it's never elaborated on ever. And weirder yet is that in D4 he shows up again, but since Bowser and his brother were defeated before, these are both fakes. So there's Bowser, fake Bowser, Bowser's brother, and fake Bowser's brother. They need to get this guy in the next Mario Kart. If we can have Baby Rosalina and Pink Gold Peach, we can have fake Bowser's brother. Anyway, look, I know this whole section on this game has been pretty negative, but there was something good to come out of this game's release. This game has become pretty infamous, and even at the time it had its detractors. I think it gave Nintendo a bit of a harsh lesson about game difficulty, which resulted in us getting much more balanced and fair experiences moving forward. I don't want to come across as someone who hates difficulty. I like difficult games, but only when that challenge is well designed and punishing at a reasonable degree. This is not either of those things. This game is not rewarding or satisfying to play, and it seems Nintendo quickly understood that once the game went public back in '86. It did sell a whopping 2.5 million copies, which was still pretty insane at the time, but most of those sales were probably just on name alone. I don't imagine it was because this game had good word of mouth. I would honestly recommend skipping this one. It's pretty unremarkable in most regards and will do nothing but frustrate and bore you with its repetition and bad design. But if you like your patience being pushed to its absolute limit, be my guest. Once again, the best version is unequivocally the All-Stars version for the same reasons as Mario 1. This is the version where the game received its The Lost Levels subtitle to differentiate it from the Western Super Mario Bros. 2. In Japan, that game came to be known as Super Mario USA. There's also Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color that includes both the games we've talked about here. Real talk, these are by far the worst way to play both games. The screen crunch is absolutely horrendous and the camera jerks around in the most nauseating way possible. Playing Lost Levels, or Super Mario for Super Players as it's called here, would be pretty horrific. I can't say I ever want to experience that. The small quality of life updates that version adds can't make up for such a glaring flaw. Well, that concludes this first episode of the Mario 40th Anniversary Superspective. Tell me what you think and how excited you are for the rest of this series, as well as your opinion on both the games we discussed in the comments. As always, these videos are an opportunity for us all to share our opinions and experiences. Always makes for a great conversation. We'll be back next week to talk about Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3, so make sure you're subscribed to keep up with that, drop a like, and go follow our second channel to catch some fun live streams. See you soon!